Atlanta Reading Discussion is sponsored by Books Barn, selling quality books for your reading pleasure since 1906. Recorded in Roswell, Georgia. Welcome to Atlanta Reading Discussion, ARD. I'm your host, Virginia, and today we will be discussing The Memory Keeper's Daughter by Kim Edwards. Caution, there are spoilers in this episode. The Memory Keeper's Daughter by Kim Edwards shows the lives of Dr. David Henry and his wife Nora. The book begins in winter of 1964, where Nora is rushed to the hospital to give birth to their unborn twins. There, David is forced to deliver the babies with the help of his nurse, Caroline Gill. The first baby, a boy they name Paul, is healthy and strong. But as soon as David delivers the second child, he realizes something is wrong. The baby girl, Phoebe, is born with trisomy 21, also known as Down syndrome. Knowing from personal experience, David does not want Nora to go through the pain of raising a child with a disability. David's sister had a congenital heart defect and died at an early age. He saw the hurt and stress it put on his mother and wants to spare Nora. He panics and makes a split-second decision to give the baby to Caroline the nurse and instructs her to take the baby away to an institution. Instead, Caroline keeps the baby and raises it as her own in another city away from the Henrys. When Nora wakes up after the delivery, David can't bring himself to tell Nora about Phoebe, so he says she died. David struggles to keep this secret from his family, which causes him to slowly fade away. Nora feels that David is isolating himself and turns to other lovers to fill the empty hole, while Caroline attempts to integrate Phoebe into normal society. As the years go on, Caroline and David remain in contact. Caroline writes letters and sends pictures to keep David connected to Phoebe. David and Nora's marriage eventually fails and they get a divorce. One day, Nora gets a call from the hospital that David has died of a heart attack. She returns to his house to clean it and discovers the hidden letters and pictures of what she thought was her dead daughter. She becomes furious at David and calls Caroline demanding to meet Phoebe. Caroline agrees, and the mother and daughter are happily reunited after a long separation. We will begin our program with tweets from the fans. Our first tweet is from Thomas in Alabama. He asks, "The novel begins in 1964. Do you think our attitude towards people with disabilities has changed since then?" Oh, most definitely. During the 1960s, people with disabilities were viewed as below the rest of society, and they were looked down upon and treated like a disease. Once a child with disabilities was born, most of the time they were put away in an institution with other disabled people and were separated from society. Edwards does a good job of showing this attitude of fear as soon as Phoebe is born, and she writes, "A classic case. He remembered his professor saying as they examined a similar child years ago, a mongoloid. Do you know what that means?" On page 16. Edwards shows the fear that David has as soon as Phoebe is born. David knows how society and his wife will view this child if she were to be kept and raised in his home. Today, our society is much more accepting and welcoming to those with disabilities. Laws have been put in place to help integrate people with special needs into our everyday lives. Additionally, organizations have been established to provide support and funding for medical research. Also, society as a whole has learned to embrace the differences and contributions these special needs populations bring to our world. Yes, they may seem different from your typical individual, but in today's diverse society, there are more similarities than differences. I think society has come to realize that and has made a lot of progress in accepting those with disabilities. Our second question comes from Paige in Texas. She asks, "In one decision, David drastically changed people's lives. Could you understand his reasons for doing what he did?" Well, he was doing what was best for his family at the time. He didn't know that his decision would drastically change the lives of not only him and his family, but other people around him, including Caroline Gill. Also, during the 1960s, people with disabilities were looked down upon and were isolated from the rest of society. He also knew that Phoebe could die at an early age, and he thought that it would be easier to handle the death of a newborn, rather than the death of a young child. Edwards shows this when she writes, This poor child will most likely have a serious heart defect, a fatal one. I am trying to spare us all a terrible grief. Page 18 and 19. David made this extreme decision based on personal experience because of his sister, who died at age 12 of a heart condition. Also, David knew that Phoebe would be an outsider because of the social norms of the time period. Our final question was submitted by Camille from Iowa. Camille asks, what was Caroline's true motivation in taking the baby? Caroline's original intention was to leave Phoebe at the institution as David had requested. But once she arrived there, she was horrified by the conditions the residents were put in. They were tested on like lab rats, treated like vermin, and degraded just because they were different. Edwards describes, she entered a hallway, fluorescent lights humming against the high ceiling, the air thick with ceiling fluid, steamed vegetables, the faint yellow scent of urine. Page 29. After walking around the institution, Caroline realized that she couldn't bring herself to leave Phoebe there. She knew she would regret it and would hate herself for not giving the baby a chance. Another main reason that Caroline decided to keep the baby was because this newborn was a part of David. Caroline had always been in love with David. She never showed her affection because she knew David was married and would never leave his wife. Edwards shows Caroline's secret affection for David when she writes, his eyes caught hers, and before she knew, before she crossed the room to shake his hand, before he opened his mouth to speak his name, David Henry, Caroline was sure of one single simple fact. The person she'd been waiting for had come. Page 27. Caroline never intended to keep Phoebe and raise her as her own, but after seeing the conditions of the institution, she realized she could not bring herself to leave her there. We would now like to transition over to Diffs and Sims. Today we are comparing the book The Memory Keeper's Daughter by Kim Edwards to the movie that was released in 2008. The first similarity between the book and the movie is the plot. Both the book and the movie follow the same plot of a doctor who is burdened with a disabled child, fears the future, and gives the baby to the nurse, who raises it as her own. Both pieces hit all the main points, but each have their own flair to grab and keep the reader or viewer's attention. The second similarity between the book and the movie is Nora's affair. Both the novel and the film use Nora's affairs to show how unhappy she is in her marriage. In the movie, there is a scene where she goes off with another man after modeling for him. This scene is one major way the film shows how Nora is trying to fill the emptiness caused by Phoebe's death and her dissolving relationship with David. The third similarity is Caroline's fight for equal education. Caroline's fight for Phoebe's education is one characteristic that both the film and the book share. Edwards shows the struggle that Caroline endures to get Phoebe into school when she writes, she goes to school, public school, with all the other kids. I had to fight like hell for them to take her. Page 249. For Caroline to be able to get Phoebe into the public school was a very big accomplishment, seeing as most of the time the school board didn't approve of special ed children in the district. The first difference between the movie and the book is a car accident. One major difference between the movie and the book that stuck out to me was that after Nora had been home with Paul and coping with Phoebe's death, she began to drink and actually got into a minor car accident. The book describes this moment when Edward writes, she remembered the car bouncing over the curb and coming to a gentle stop in the median, beneath a pine oak. She did not remember hitting the windshield, but it looked like a spider web. When she pressed her hand to her forehead, it came away lightly smeared with blood. Page 85. Edwards uses the drinking and the car crash to show how Nora is coping with Phoebe's death. The second difference between the book and the movie is Nora's obvious postpartum depression. After Phoebe's death, the book goes into detail on Nora's postpartum depression. The novel goes into greater detail on Nora's condition and how she handles Phoebe's death. Edwards describes a scene where Nora's friends come over to meet Paul. One of the women has made 2 quilts, a blue one and a pink one. When giving the gift to Nora, she only gave the blue one. Edwards describes, he had a sister. Her name was Phoebe. I want somebody to say her name. Do you hear me? I want someone to remember her name. Edwards, page 47. This moment shows the pain and anger Nora is experiencing after losing Phoebe. The final difference between the book and the movie is the backstory of David and Nora. The book gives a detailed story, not only on the lives of the Henrys in 1964, but also a story on how Nora and David met. Edwards describes, "The sleeve of her green coat brushed his, and he smelled her perfume, something delicate and yet persuasive." Page 5. By giving the reader insight to David and Nora, Edwards is giving the reader a chance to get to know the characters better and grow close to them. It also sets the tone for the rest of the novel. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us here on Atlanta Reading Discussion. This has been your host, Virginia. Thank you, and we'll see you all again tomorrow. Atlanta Reading Discussion is sponsored by Books Barn, selling quality books for your reading pleasure since 1906. Recorded in Roswell, Georgia.